Chapter 9, Part 2 of Life of Henry David Thoreau by Henry Salt. Society, then, is to be reformed, according to Thoreau's doctrine, by individual effort, and the gospel which he preaches to the individual is that of simplicity. Simplification of life, by which is meant a questioning and perhaps rejection of the various artificial comforts and luxuries, and a dependence only on the actual necessaries, food, shelter, clothing, and fuel, is repeatedly advocated by Thoreau from his own practical experience as lending strength, courage, and self-reliance to the individual character, and so, in proportion to the extent of its practice, to the state. It must be repeated that this doctrine, however strange and unpalatable it may be to the popular mood, is not that of an ascetic. The simplicity which Thoreau inculcates does not, like asceticism, renounce the luxuries of life by way of a religious penance, but because it is convinced that life, on the whole, is healthier and happier without them. What he urges is not that men should deny themselves certain comforts while they still believe them to be comforts, but that in each case they should test the truth by practical experience, and not continue to regard as necessaries many things which a day's trial would prove to be superfluous and perhaps actually harmful. This distinction between a natural taste and an acquired habit is a vital one, yet it is generally overlooked by the opponents of Thoreau's philosophy. He laughs at the absurdity of those writers who talk of the usefulness of artificial wants in drawing out the resources of nature, since every artificial want must of necessity bring with it its own nemesis of proportionally increased toil, whereas, on the contrary, the practice of hardihood and frugality is productive of health, independence, and restfulness both to body and mind. In a word, the simplicity which he preaches is based not on the repression, but rather on the better gratification of the true pleasures of existence. Which is the more enjoyable to indulge, the spiritual instinct or the sensual? Let each man make his own choice, but let him at least be sure that he is really following his own tastes, and not merely conforming to the dictates of custom and tradition. The charge often made against Thoreau, that he is in opposition to the course of modern progress, and prefers savagery to civilization, is only tenable on a very short-sighted and perfunctory view of the meaning of his gospel. He himself notes in his diary that his lectures used to call forth such inquiries as, "Would you have us return to the savage state?" A misconception of his meaning, which was doubtless rendered more general by his brevity of speech, epigrammatic tone, and characteristic unwillingness to explain himself. But a careful study of his writings as a whole, and of Walden in particular, can leave us in no doubt as to his true position on this point. He expressly states his belief that civilization is a real advance in the condition of mankind, and that the farmer displaces the Indian because he redeems the meadow, and so makes himself stronger and in some respects more natural. But while making this admission, he points out what is too often overlooked by comfortable statisticians, that though the majority of civilized men are better situated than the savage, there is a minority which is not so. He asserts, then, that the problem to which we should apply ourselves is how to combine the hardiness of the savage with the intellectualness of the civilized man. When he inveighs against the numerous follies and defects and diseases observable in civilization, he does so not because he doubts or denies its superiority to the savage state, but because, to quote his own words, he wishes to show at what a sacrifice this advantage is at present obtained, and to suggest that we may possibly so live as to secure all the advantage without suffering any of the disadvantage. In the same connection, it should be noted that Thoreau exhibits no reactionary feeling against the strides made by science and modern mechanical invention, however strongly he may protest against the unnecessary desecration of natural scenery. He descants on the enterprise, courage, and alertness of commerce, which goes steadily on its path undismayed and unhindered by the obstacles of climate and season, and declares that it cheered him in his Walden hermitage when he heard the train rattle past each morning on its road to Boston. All he desiderates is a worthier object as the end and aim of so much toil and industry. Nor was he, as some have supposed, an enemy to art, though he may have been, as Emerson says, insensible to some fine traits of culture. He did not wish to banish ornament from our dwellings, except such as is external and superficial, a mere conventional and fashionable appendage, instead of what it should be, a simple and natural growth. It may here be worth while to inquire how far these principles of individualism and simplicity were meant by Thoreau to be applied, and how far they were rightly applicable to the social question of his time. There is no indication whatever in any of his writings that he intended his doctrines to be understood directly and literally as containing a panacea for human ills. He did not wish his fellow beings to leave their towns and villages in order to live in shanties, nor was he under the impression, as some of his critics would have us believe, that the inhabitants of crowded cities were free to march out and live in blissful seclusion in some neighboring wood. Thoreau, whatever the limitations of his genius may have been, was a shrewd and clear-sighted man, and if any of his readers find themselves attributing to him such ineptitudes as those just mentioned, they may feel assured that the misunderstanding is on their own side, and that by lack of sympathy they have failed to grasp his true meaning. It should be remembered that he wrote primarily and immediately for his own fellow citizens of Concord and a limited New England audience, and further, that the social problem was far less difficult and complex at that time in New England than it is now after a lapse of 30 or 40 years. Extreme poverty was a rare exception and not a normal condition among the peasantry of Concord. There was more elbow room and opportunity for individual effort than in an English country town, so that an example such as that set by Thoreau was not by any means the impossibility which it would have been in other places and under other circumstances. As a matter of fact, he seldom recommended his own way of living to his neighbors or fellow townsmen, being convinced that each man must shape his own career, though in one or two cases, as in the conversation with a thriftless Irish laborer, recorded in Walden, we find him pointing out the advantages of a frugal diet, since those who can dispense with tea, coffee, butter, milk, and flesh meat can also spare themselves the heavy labor which is required to purchase these unnecessary comforts. But in so far as Thoreau addressed his doctrines to the general public, it was distinctly not with the intent of persuading them to live as he did, but in the hope of stimulating independent thought by the force of his example and admonition, and of drawing attention to those simple common-sense principles without which there can be no lasting health or contentment either for individual or community. Mr. Stevenson has remarked of Thoreau that in his whole works one can find no trace of pity. If it were possible at all to maintain this assertion, it could only be in the limited sense that he dwells usually on the iniquity of the wrongdoer rather than on the feelings of the sufferer. He does not, for instance, express his pity for the slave, though we know from the accounts already quoted how strong his pity was, but he shows it in a more practical form by his attitude towards the slaveholder. It is true that with his characteristic dislike of system, he disclaims any distinct theory of compassion, while his optimistic belief in the beneficence of nature prevents him from repining at the mere existence of suffering and wrong. Nevertheless, Thoreau is himself one of the humanest of writers, and has contributed to the literature of humanitarianism some of its most striking protests. His detestation of war was shown in his refusal to pay the poll tax at the time when the United States made an unjustifiable attack on Mexico. He declares fighting to be a damnable business, and at variance with the will and conscience of those compelled to engage in it, soldiers, colonel, captain, corporal, powder monkeys, and all. Of his opinions concerning slaveholding, it is not necessary to say more. But there is a remarkable saying of his about John Brown which deserves to be quoted in this connection. Noting the fact that Brown had not received a college education, but had studied liberty in the great university of the West, he adds, "Such were his humanities, and not any study of grammar. He would have left a Greek accent slanting the wrong way, and righted up a falling man." It would be well if all our professors and students of literae humaniores would lay this admirable sentiment to heart. Humanity to animals was one of the most conspicuous virtues in Thoreau's character, and is constantly, if indirectly, advocated in his writings. His conception of the animal races has been described as a sort of mystic evolution. Thus he regards the foxes as rudimental burrowing men, still standing on their defense, awaiting their transformation, while the dog is to the fox as the white man to the red. The horse appears to him as a human being in a humble state of existence, and the human way in which the oxen behave when loosed from the yoke at evening affects him pathetically. The wild shaggy moose in the Maine forests are moose men, clad in a sort of Vermont gray or homespun, and he expresses respect even for the skunk, for its suggested resemblance to one of the human aborigines of the country. Individuality is recognized and respected by him in the non-human no less than the human races. He complains of man's not educating the horse, not trying to develop his nature, but merely getting work out of him. It was this sense of brotherhood, as I have already remarked, which gave Thoreau his extraordinary power over beasts and birds, and his singular humanity to animals is due to the same source. During the greater part of his life he was a vegetarian in practice, and in Walden has made profession of his faith in the humanities of diet. His position as a naturalist was strongly influenced by the same humane sentiments. His methods were not those of the anatomist and man of science. He held that nature must be viewed humanly to be viewed at all. That is, her scenes must be associated with humane affections. She was to him a living entity, to be loved and reverenced, and not a subject for cold and unimpassioned observation. Accordingly, in his remarks on nature and natural history, there is a decided prevalence of that peculiarly introspective and moralizing mood, characteristic of the poet-naturalist as distinct from the scientist, which seeks to transmute the mere facts and results of external observation into symbolical thoughts and images which may illustrate the life of man. It is this human self-consciousness that differentiates Thoreau from the naturalist and observer pure and simple, such as Gilbert White. It has been remarked by Mr. John Burroughs that it was supernatural rather than natural history that Thoreau studied, and that he made no discoveries of importance in the scientific field because he looked through nature instead of at her, and was more intent on the natural history of his own thought than of that of the bird. It is no doubt true that Thoreau's keenness of vision was generally in proportion to the interest of the subject with which he had to deal. He saw what he already had in mind. His observations, however, are not the less important because they differ from those acquired by the ordinary method. On the contrary, they are more valuable on that account, inasmuch as the poet is higher and rarer than the naturalist. Nathaniel Hawthorne has recorded how Thoreau was enabled by this inner faculty to see the water lily as few others could see it. He has beheld beds of them unfolding in due succession as the sunrise stole gradually from flower to flower, a sight not to be hoped for, unless when a poet adjusts his inward eye to a proper focus with the outward organ. This idealist quality constitutes the peculiar property of Thoreau's teaching on the subject of nature, but that it did not disqualify him from doing good service as a scientific observer may be gathered from the remarkable tribute which has been paid to him by one of Darwin's interpreters. Like no one else, he knew the meaning of every note and movement of bird and beast, and fish and insect. Born out of due time, just too early for the great change in men's views of nature which transferred all interest in outer life from the mere dead things one sees in museums to their native habits and modes of living, he was yet in some sort a vague and mystical anticipatory precursor of the modern school of functional biologists. Page after page of his diary notes facts about the pollen showers of pine trees, the fertilization of skunk cabbage, the nesting of birds, the preferences of mink or muskrat, the courtship of butterflies, all of a piece with those minute observations on which naturalists nowadays build their most interesting theories. Footnote: Grant Allen, Fortnightly Review, May 1888. End footnote. The conclusion of our view of Thoreau's doctrines thus brings us back to the contention with which we started. He was an idealist who looked through the outer husk and surface of life, and saw the true reality in what to most men is but a vision and a dream. He had in large measure what Emerson calls the philosopher's perception of identity. The phenomena of time and space did not affect him. Walden Pond was to him an Atlantic Ocean. A moment was eternity. The means on which he relies for the correction of popular delusions are the independence of the individual mind, and those simple, practical modes of living which alone can keep a man independent. Finally, for all his asperity of tone in the reproof of what he considered to be blameworthy, he was a firm believer in the gradual progress and ultimate renovation of mankind, being convinced that improvement is the only excuse for reproduction. It was no cynical or misanthropic faith that found expression in his writings. End of Chapter 9.